There are certain toys that are memorable. Some of the memorable toys became very popular with the right balance of affordability, attractiveness, and function. Others are memorable, for me at least, because they were infused with the fact that, for whatever reason, I remember realizing that I would never be able to have that toy. The Crusader 101, Part 3. RC, It Can Be Done. After disassembly and cleaning, Crusader 101, number 1, has been reassembled using only major components: body, interior, front and rear wheel assemblies. This was done to take the car to some radio control experts at Hobby Hobby. Hobby Hobby is my local hobby store that specializes in radio control everything: boats, aircraft, and cars. The staff were incredibly helpful and were as excited about this project as I am. Here are the radio control components I purchased, as recommended by these experts, to replace the wired controller of the car. A speed controller for the drive wheels, a steering servo for the front wheels, a NiCad battery pack to power the car, and a 2-channel radio control receiver and transmitter. Time now to install these modern components and resto-mod this toy. I removed the front wheel assembly from the car to determine how best to integrate the steering servo to steer the front wheels. I removed the wheels from the front axle stubs and began. The original steering mechanism was composed of a DC motor and a series of gears connected to one large gear that had a metal shaft on it. This shaft is connected to the tie rod of the steering assembly. When the gear would rotate, it would move the metal shaft in an arc, pushing the tie rod left or right as desired to steer the car. This required careful, partial disassembly, as the motor had to be removed as well as all of the gears except the one that moved the tie rod. This was accomplished by first identifying the gears that needed to be removed, then removing the shafts of these gears that they rotated on. The steering box was separated from the front steering assembly by removing 2 self-tapping screws. The motor was removed first to free up the gears. Then the gear shafts were removed by carefully prying the metal lock fasteners on the shaft ends using the blade of a knife. Once pried off, the shafts could be removed and the gears just fell out of the assembly. The only gear to remain would be the one with the steering rod. I made sure that the tabs at the side of the steering box were secure using some pliers and reattached the steering box back onto the front steering mechanism using the original self-tapping screws. Now I can assess where best to place the steering servo to actuate the remaining gear that will then steer the front wheels. I decided to put the servo as close to the steering gear as possible, marking the spot and removing plastic to create a mounting area for the servo, checking to ensure that my measurements were accurate. Once the servo's mounting spot was completed, I had to create 2 attachment posts to secure the servo to the steering assembly. I used some square styrene stock, as it's easy to work with, and I had some on hand. The mounting blocks were fabricated and used to install the servo into the steering assembly. I can now test the servo before attaching it to the steering gear. To do this, the servo is connected to the receiver, which is also connected to the speed controller, which is then connected to the NiCad battery, which has been charged. The radio control unit is loaded with fresh batteries, turned on before the speed controller is turned on, and the steering servo is moving. Next, I had to fabricate an arm to connect the servo to the steering gear. I measured the distance between the servo arm and a hole I drilled into the steering gear. Then, I cut a piece of spring steel and bent the ends to the required length to create an arm. I reattached the front wheels and tested the new assembly. We have 21st century steering. Next, the rear wheel assembly has to be connected to the speed controller module. I removed the rear wheel assembly from the car, which is attached with 4 self-tapping screws. Then it was time to disconnect the control mechanism by disconnecting the wires that had been attached to the car since 1964. The wires had metal cones that connected them in a molded plastic cylinder, creating a compression connection, eliminating any need for soldering. Out with the old, in with the new. A little bit of cleaning, connect the wires from the motor to the speed controller, connect the battery, and turn everything on. It works! Forward and reverse. Time to see if everything will work together. To attach the front wheel assembly back on the car, the firewall required some trimming to make room for the servo. The front servo was connected to the receiver, speed controller, and battery, and then tested. It worked without any issues. Then, the rear wheel assembly was attached, and the wires from the rear motor were connected to the speed controller. This is a temporary connection, just for testing purposes only, so the wires were twisted together and wrapped in tape. As you can see, there wasn't any need to drill any holes for the wiring, as there's an opening at the front of the trunk. It's great that this car has such a large trunk to store all of the RC components. I didn't bother to put the trunk lid back, as this is only a test. Here we go. Wow! The look of yesterday and the functionality of today. Now that we have this resto mod working, it's time to decide what to do to make the car look the part as well. And there are a lot of things to think about, well, such as what color to paint the body? Should the wheels and tires be upgraded? Should the driver have any companions? What else can we make function on the car? There are many other things to consider for our next installment of this project. Until then,